Hello students, this week we're going to cover how to be able to select information out of our tables and out of our database. You'll see that we covered Chapter 19 and 20 this week. Chapter 19 covers more specific operations you can do with things in the toolbox in Visual Studio. We don't cover that as much. I'd rather get into more in Chapter 20 where we start to cover executing queries with ADO.NET to be able to get data and manipulate data with those CRUD operations that we talked about last week out of our database using those statements, those select statements, those insert statements. So we're going to cover the Chapter 20 PowerPoint, and instead of going through the PowerPoint, I want to go ahead and just do an example of the customer application that they do on page 657 of the book. It's also in the PowerPoint. They go through it step by step. It's figure 2010 in the book, adding a code for a customer DB class as well as an MMA books DB class where we actually modify a connection. So I'm going to go ahead and modify and add the class to modify that connection and be able to establish a connection to our database that we have local to our project. We can see here on the right hand side. And then also I'll go ahead and write the code to be able to get the customer from that as well. So if we go to this customer maintenance form, we can see that it's like any other form we'd work with. We have the ability to get a customer. So from the UI, it looks like we're going to type in the customer's ID here, get that customer, and then we're going to go to the database with our select statement, select the customer with that customer ID, and it's going to return and show up here on the form, the customer's name, address, and it's going to give us a visual representation of the customer we're working with. That way we know whether or not the correct customer was returned before we go ahead and modify or delete that customer. So it's going to give us a little visual cue as to if that's the actual customer we think that we were working with. So at the end of Chapter 20, there are some instructions on what I'm about to do if you want to follow along there. Otherwise, I'll just kind of start doing it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add the connection to our database. So I'm going to add a new class. And that class is going to be called MMA Books DB. So this is going to be the class that's actually going to represent our connection. I'm going to make it static so we're only going to have one connection to our database at a time. We're only going to be making one read or one write, so it can just be a static class. And then the instructions state to have one method that's also static that returns a SQL connection called getConnection. Notice we don't have the correct imports here yet, so I'm going to go ahead and control period on here and tell it that I'm using SQL Data SQL Client. And now I'm receiving an error because I say I want to return a SQL connection, but I've not yet returned one. So the first thing I'm going to do is create our connection string to our database. It's going to say, here's how you can find my database. So I'm going to try to break this up on a few lines here to make it easier to read. I'm going to go ahead and say data source equals, and a lot of this is boilerplate that you can get straight from the book, so I'm not making any of it up. So our data source is going to be our local DB, which is a database local to our machine, using MS SQL Local DB, which is a version of SQL Server that comes with Visual Studio. I'm going to add a little more to our connection string. I want to tell it what the database file name is that's attached to our project. And this is important when to use this data directory to tell it that this database is actually inside of our project. That way when you turn it in and I go to grade it, it already points to the one that's inside your project. And go ahead and add some more to it. And I'm going to say integrated security equals true. Just another thing the database needs to know. What type of security is attached, if it's Windows authentication or anything like that. From there we can make our SQL connection with it. So our SQL connection equals new SQL connection. We're going to pass it in the constructor our connection string so it knows how to reach our database already. And then we're going to go ahead and return that connection so whoever calls this method already has the connection to our database. Now notice a lot of this syntactically might be difficult and you might get it wrong the first time, but it should give you some error messages that tell you exactly what's wrong. See, there's some semicolons that you may want to make sure to not miss. Want to make sure there's spaces in between the direct thing. So if you don't get it working the first time, don't worry, you're not alone. Just keep working at it or shoot me an email. The next part of this, we're going to set up our customer database class. It's going to reach out to our customer tables and get back a customer. So I'm going to go ahead and add another class called CustomerDB. I'm going to go ahead and make the class public. We can go ahead and make it static as well. Since we have a single connection, we can have a single instance of this CustomerDB that's available for our application. I'm going to go ahead and make another public static method that returns the customer. We're going to call it getCustomer. And it's going to pass in the ID of the customer from the form, which we'll see here in a second. I'll call it customer ID. Now I'll just go ahead and return a new customer to get rid of the error message. And then we can come back to this customer form, click the Get Customer button, and we can see that it goes through some validation to make sure that the customer exists, make sure they populated that text box, and then it calls this .getCustomer. So this instance of this form .getCustomer, and we'll go ahead and F12 on that, which takes us down here, which shows this little commented out piece of code. So I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that. And it says that the customer that's attached to this form, we can see as a class level variable, customer, is going to be set equal to the CustomerDB.getCustomer, and we're going to pass it that customer ID that they populated in that text box above. And then we'll also see after it gets that customer back up here, if it's not null, so if it finds a customer, display it here. Otherwise show an error message that they couldn't find the customer. So all of this code is already done for us. All we needed to simply do is just set the customer once it comes back from our database. So I'll go ahead and close that out. So these are the two classes we'll be working with. I'll go ahead and make this bigger for everybody to see. So the first thing we're going to want to be able to do is establish a connection to our database. So I'm going to say SQL connection equals, and we're going to use that static class that we already created to be able to get our connection. So MMABooksDB.getConnection, and it should return us a SQL connection. We'll be getting an error here because we have not imported the correct using statements. So now we have that. The next thing I want to do is make a select statement. So the statement we'll be using in tandem with this connection to be able to get a customer from the database. So we can say select statement equals, and we'll go ahead and break this up into a couple lines again to make it easier to read. So I want to say select customer ID, name, address, city, state, zip code. And I'm going to put a space here, that way when I go on to the next line I can immediately say from customers and put another space. And I might want to put a plus here as well, where customer ID equals at customer ID. And we'll see why I put this at sign here in a second. This is called a parameter that we're going to pass into this select statement dynamically based on what customer they're actually searching for here. So going down a couple more lines, I want to set up a SQL command that we can use to establish a connection to our database as well as pass the SQL command. Equals new SQL command. And there's a constructor that takes in the statement and a connection. So it's going to pass our select statement that we have here to be able to select from the database, as well as the connection that we get from our static class MMA books connection. From there we can use our select statement to add parameters to it, which there's a list of parameters attached to our query. We're going to add it. We're going to add with value actually, because we have a value. We're going to say if I tell you at customer ID, what that actually means is the customer ID that they passed in to the application. So that allows this to be dynamic. So I'm going to go ahead and put a try catch statement here. And we're going to try to catch a SQL connection error to make sure we're able to connect to our database. So I'm going to catch a SQL exception. I'm going to go ahead and throw the exception if it happens. I might need to add the import statement for the SQL. No, maybe not. What am I missing here? SQL exception. Alright, there, it found it. I might have just been mistyping it wrong there. I'm also going to add a finally statement here because I'm going to want to close the connection to the database once it happens. So first I'm going to do connection, which is our SQL connection, and I'm going to open the connection to our database. And then down here I'm going to say connection.close to make sure whether or not it successfully reads a customer, we're going to close the connection to the database. So after we open that connection, we're going to want to establish a SQL data reader that's going to read the thing that's coming out of our database. I'll call it customer reader equals, and then we're going to use that select command again, and we're going to execute the select statement. And then we can go ahead and use a command behavior. And we're going to tell it that we expect just a single row to come back out of the database. So now we can use if the customer reader in the read operation, if it comes back with something from the database, in other words, it found a record, we're going to go ahead and return the customer. Otherwise, if it didn't find a record, we're just going to return null. Which if we go back to the other form, we'll see if it comes back null, we're going to display that error message. So that should be handled. Here we're going to set up a new customer equals new customer. And then I'll use an object initializer to set all the variables. So the customer ID, which we should already know, but we'll just set it for good measure. We have to cast it as an integer coming back from the database. from the custReader object. So it's called customer ID. And then we need to return a lot of other things. I'll put a semicolon there to end that statement. Then we need to return a lot of other strings. So then we're going to say the name of the customer equals custReader name as a string. So we need to cast it to a string there with a comma. And then I'm going to copy this because we're going to be selecting a lot of things as a string from this object. So address equals getting back the address as a string. Copy again. City. Again, we're getting the city back. State, same thing. And zip code, same thing, it's another string. Okay, so now we have established a connection to our database. Hopefully I wrote everything correctly there. We'll get an error. We're selecting the customer ID, name, address, state, zip code from customers where the customer ID is equal to the parameter we set up here, which is just equal to the customer ID that they sent into the application. We're going to execute that select statement. We're going to read it here. We'll return null if we found one. And we're going to close the connection. So now, all right, we have a try. If we're able to, all right, I never returned the customer here. Return customer, and that should have got rid of my error message. Okay. Now if you need to have data for your application, you can double click your MMA Books DB and that comes up with a Server Explorer, and then you can come to your tables and right click customers and then show table data, and then once you show table data you'll be able to see actual customer IDs here. So if you need data to use to test with, make sure you show the data of your table in your Server Explorer. So again, just expand your database, your table, and then right-click Show Table Data. Okay, so now I want to run the application to see if it works. I'm going to input a customer ID. Say get customer, and then this customer comes back from our database. Let's go ahead and get customer 10, and there's a different customer. Customer 5, there's a different customer. Okay, so it appears this works. So you'll notice in your PowerPoint presentation that it's pretty much verbatim your product assignment. So definitely look in your Chapter 20 PowerPoint presentation and Chapter 20 in the book. For good examples on the rest of this project, you'll need to also implement the add, modify, and delete for your assignment, which is just essentially the same code with different statements, an insert statement, an update statement, and a delete statement. So hopefully this video helps. If you need any further assistance, make sure you reach out and email me, and have a good week. Thanks.